All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is, I think, the last session of the event. So appreciate all of you, staying back for the session. I am Hiren Chandiramani, and I'm the go-to-market specialist for S3, and I cover S3 globally. So today we're going to talk about how you can optimize your costs and usage of S3. And we're going to cover a bunch of different topics. I'm going to start off by talking about different patterns of data access. And then we'll talk a little bit about our storage classes that we have today and how you can use those to optimize your costs on S3. And we'll do a little bit of a double click on intelligent tiering. Intelligent tiering is super interesting in my mind. It's one of the best storage classes we have. So we're going to do a little bit of a double click on intelligent tiering. And then finally, we'll talk about Storage Lens. Storage Lens was a feature we launched, I think, in November of 2020, and has been quickly become one of the most popular features that we have with S3. It's one of my favorite features. I talk to all my customers about S3 Storage Lens, and I hope that you guys will find it useful and will also use it going forward. Okay, so before I get into the meat of the presentation, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to all of you. I want to say thank you to our millions of our customers who are today using S3. And what's kind of interesting about this slide is the breadth of the different use cases that we see among our customer base, right? When we first launched S3 back in 2006, content hosting or website hosting was the most popular use case. But if you look across the spectrum of all our customers today, you'll see a very, very large variety of different use cases, all the way from data lakes to medical imaging, to AI ML training, to many, many other different use cases. And each one of these use cases has a different or unique access pattern. And we want to understand those access patterns when we talk about how you can optimize your storage cost. And the reason that we have these different use cases on S3 is because of some of the characteristics of S3, right? Number one, it is the industry leading in scalability, in availability, in durability. It has industry leading performance. It has unmatched security. And it's for all these different reasons that you see on this slide that we have found that our customers have adopted S3 widely, broadly, for all the different use cases that I mentioned earlier. All right, I'm here to talk about how to optimize your cost. So let's get into that right away. The first thing I want to talk about is how we have innovated. When S3 was launched in 2006 all the way now, we have decreased our cost, but that's not all that we have done. We have also innovated. We have innovated with different storage classes. Back in 2018, we launched S3 Intelligent Tiering. And as I mentioned, I'll talk a little bit more about that. It is the only storage class which is out there in the cloud that allows you to optimize your usage and your cost automatically by monitoring the access pattern of your data. In 2019, we launched S3 Glacier Deep Archive. That is by far the lowest storage cost in the cloud today. And in 2021, we were very, very excited to launch S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval, or GIR. This is a brand new storage class that is designed for long-term archival of data, but with millisecond access to your data. So you can store your data for a very, very long time, but when you do need it, you get it back in milliseconds. And I feel it's a game changer. We have got really, really good feedback from our customers about this storage class. So let's talk about what this means, and let's dive into all the different storage classes we have. As you can see right now, we have about 8 different storage classes. Starting from left to right, the first one is intelligent tiering. Like I mentioned previously, it is the only storage class in the cloud today that delivers automatic cost savings by monitoring your access patterns. It is ideal for use cases where you don't know what the access pattern is going to be. Customers use intelligent tiering to store data that is shared among many different applications, maybe among many different users, and such as use cases such as analytics, data lakes, machine learning. Many of these use cases have the characteristics where you have many users accessing the same data set, right? And I want to highlight that we we monitor the cost, we monitor the access and move it among tiers, and I'll double click on that, automatically saving you money, right? We also, at reInvent 2021, when we launched GIR, we also introduced a new tier within intelligent tiering called Archive Instant Access that provides you the same savings. And I'll also talk about that a little bit. These are what I would call the other storage classes, which are often used by our other customers. These are our storage classes which are in 3 or more availability zones. And they all have different characteristics, and you use them depending on what your workload looks like. So again, going from left to right, we have S3 standard. This is the ideal storage class, which is used for frequently accessed data. Or this is the best choice for data which is accessed for maybe more than once a month, right? And it's also the ideal storage class for data that has small objects. They're either small objects or short-lived objects or objects that are accessed frequently over the course of a month, more than once a month. If you have data which is not accessed as frequently, and let's say about once a month, then you want to consider S3 infrequent access. In exchange for a lower cost of storing data in S3 infrequent access, you pay a little higher cost to access the data, which is why we say there's a break-even point. That break-even point is about once a month. So if you're accessing data once a month, S3 infrequent access is probably the right storage class for you. Going further to the right, the new storage class that we introduced, S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval, is ideal for data that you will access maybe 3 to 4 times a year. Okay, so 3 to 4 times a year. In exchange, the price drops to store the data, but again, you pay a little bit higher to access the data. So just going from left to right again, S3 standard for data that is frequently accessed, small data or very short-lived. Going further to the right, S3 infrequent access for data that's accessed once a month. And then S3 Glacier Instant Retrieval for data that is accessed 3 to 4 times a year. All of these storage classes have 11 nines of durability, high availability, and data is stored redundantly in 3 or more availability zones, okay? Now, all of them have millisecond access, as I said. Now, but if you've got archival data that does not require that millisecond access, then we have 2 additional storage classes with a lower cost. The first one is S3 Glacier Flexible Retrieval, and that can give you access to your data in minutes to hours. This is different from the previous ones where I said the access was milliseconds. With Glacier Flexible Retrieval, the access is minutes to hours. And then for you have Glacier Deep Archive, which is, I mentioned, the lowest cost in the cloud, but that would give you access to your data in hours. So if you don't need your data right away and you need to store it for a long time, then we would encourage you to think about S3 Glacier Flexible Retrieval and S3 Glacier Deep Archive. Okay. We also have 2 additional storage classes for specialized workloads. The first one is what we call one zone infrequent access. This storage class is ideal for data that is either a secondary copy or is easily recreatable. And the difference from the other previous storage classes is that the data is stored in 1 availability zones. If you remember in the previous storage classes that I mentioned, the data is stored in either 3 or more availability zones. With 1 zone infrequent access, the data is stored in only 1 availability zone. I would like to point out, and this is a common misconception, we do not compromise on availability or durability. Even with 1 zone IA, the durability of the data is 11 nines, and the availability is 99.9, right? So the difference is only in the number of zones, availability zones in which the data is stored. The other one is S3 Outposts. And this delivers you an object storage for your on-premises environment, and with the same S3 APIs that you would find in AWS today. So if you have a requirement to have an on-premises environment and you want to use object storage, Outposts would be the right thing to use in this case. Okay, so how should you think about these storage classes? When you're thinking about how to use the different storage classes, there are two dimensions I would encourage you to think about. Number one is the frequency of access, and the number two is the duration of access. So like I mentioned, Glacier Instant Retrieval is great for data that is stored, that is accessed 3 to 4 times a year, right? And you're paying a very low storage cost, but a little higher access cost, which means there's a break-even point. If you're accessing your data too often and you keep your data in GIR, you're going to be landing up paying a little bit more, in which case you need to reevaluate and think about S3 infrequent access, right? So GIR is perfect for data which is stored for 3 to 4 times a year, which is accessed 3 to 4 times a year. If you're going for more, if you're accessing your data more frequently than that, then you need to think about S3 infrequent access. Now, as I mentioned, S3 infrequent access is great for data which is accessed once a month. If you happen to access the data more than that, then the right storage class for you is S3 standard. So depending on your frequency of your access, you want to choose the right storage class. The second dimension you got to think about is the duration of storage. Some of these storage classes got a minimum duration that you need to keep the data in there. So for GIR, again, for Glacier Instant Retrieval, the minimum duration that you need to keep your storage is 90 days. Your data is 90 days. If you plan on deleting your data sooner than 90 days, then you need to think about S3 infrequent access, where the minimum is 30 days. If you plan on deleting it even before that, then you got to think about S3 standard. So these are the two big dimensions you got to think about: your frequency of access and your duration of storage, while deciding which is the right storage class for you. The other thing that you need to think about is the relationship between your object size and your costs of requests. When you have your data in S3, you do pay a cost for putting the data, for getting the data, for accessing the data, right? You have the put API calls, you have the get API calls. There are costs to those calls. And there's a relationship between the object size and the number of API calls you make, right? So when you think about this, as the object size increases for a given amount of storage, or for every petabyte, right? With larger objects, you would make fewer API calls, thereby spending less. If you have very, very small objects, if you have billions and billions of objects, you're going to pay more. So when you're using S3, if you have the ability, we would encourage you to think about using larger object sizes in your application where you can. Or the other alternative is to batch them together so that you decrease the number of puts and gets you have to do, right? So think about that when you're thinking about your costs with S3 out there too. In fact, if you think about, we have Kinesis Firehose, right? And so if you're ingesting objects into S3 using Kinesis Firehose, you can actually set a threshold at which point Kinesis Firehose will then batch up operations, will batch up the objects into one large object before uploading, reducing your cost. So this is the other thing you have to consider when thinking about your cost with S3, is the size of your objects and how it matters when you do puts and gets and lists and all of the other operations that you have to do with your data. And we would encourage you to think about using larger object sizes rather than smaller ones. Okay, so there are many ways to upload your object, and we're going to talk about how you can use all the different storage classes to optimize your cost a little bit, just following a couple more slides. But one thing I do want to point out, there's sometimes it is better to ingest the object directly into the storage class that you want. Today, if you just upload an object into S3, it uploads it into S3 standard, right? Which is the storage class which costs the most, but is ideal for data which is frequently accessed, or small data, or data that is very, very short-lived. But for example, if you know you have data which is cold, and you know that data is not going to be accessed more than 3 to 4 times a year, upload it directly into Glacier Instant Retrieval. Don't go into S3 and then lifecycle it down. Upload it directly into the right storage class at ingest. And you can do that with a very simple put requests where you specify the storage class, as you can see on the slide. In this one, you actually specify the storage class to be glacier_IR, which is Glacier Instant Retrieval, and the data will land directly in the right storage class, saving you money right from the get-go. You don't have to think about tearing it down. So if you know already that your data is cold, you're not going to access it more than 3 to 4 times a year, put it directly in the right storage class. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about patterns of optimizations. Generally, we see customers have 2 distinct patterns on their data. The first one is data with very predictable or known access patterns, right? Let's use an example. For example, if you're uploading photos or videos to share with your family, typically what you see is, in one of those photo sharing websites, right? What you typically would see is that content is accessed very frequently. All your friends, all your family are looking at those photographs in the first week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe even a month. But after that first initial rush of people actually looking at those photos, there's a distinct drop in the amount of times the data is accessed. I mean, I don't remember the last time I went back and looked at photographs uploaded last year, right? They're there in the cloud, but I'm really not accessing them. That's true for most of these user-generated content. There's an initial upload, a lot of gets, a lot of people are looking at it, and then after a week, 2 weeks, after a month, it drops off drastically, right? So for use cases for that, which is a very known access pattern, you can pinpoint the time when the data becomes cold, and based on that, you can talk about how you leverage our storage classes. Some examples of those workloads include, like I said, user-generated content. Medical imaging is another very great example of that. If you have taken an X-ray, the doctor wants to see the X-ray right then, but after that, it has to be kept for years, for decades, in fact, and that X-ray is not accessed frequently. So you can really pinpoint the time when that data becomes cold. Learning resources, university courses, another great example. When the professor puts up the class, people all download it, they read it, they access it, and then within a week or 2, the traffic to it dies down, right? So you know exactly when the data becomes cold, and we would recommend our lifecycle rules for that, and I'll talk about that a little bit there. It is a very predictable one. But there's also another different data pattern, which is unpredictable or changing. In this case, you don't know what the access pattern is. You don't know when the data becomes cold, or the data may become cold and it may become hot again. And a great example of that is, again, data lakes or AI ML machine training models, right? Where the data becomes cold, you have different groups, you have different users, you have different applications accessing the same data set, and then it becomes hot again, it becomes cold again, warm again. There's no predictability of when the data becomes cold and is constantly changing. And examples of that, like I said, were data lakes, analytics, even content sharing, right? So for each one of those, there's a different strategy on how you use the different storage classes that we talked about with just in the previous slides. So let's talk about data with predictable or known patterns. For that one, we have a tool today within S3 called Storage Class Analysis. What it does, if you turn it on, you let it run for about 30 to 45 days to let it collect data, and it monitors the access pattern for your data, right? And based on the analysis it does, it will identify the point in which we recommend that you start tiering your data. I don't think it's very clear in this slide, but you can see that little dotted line on the left, which is at about 30 days. And what, in this case, Storage Class Analysis has said is that after 30 days, you should tier your data from maybe standard down to S3 infrequent access, right? So that's what Storage Class Analysis does. It analyzes your data and gives you a recommendation for when you can tier your data down to a different storage class, okay? And you can run this on all the objects in your bucket, or you can limit it to either a prefix or some object tags. So depending on what you want to do, you can reduce the scope or run it on the entire bucket. And then once you've done that, you can set up lifecycle rules. And lifecycle rules, remember, are based on the age of the data. So what you can say here is that Any data which is more than 90 days old, move it from S3 standard to Glacier instant retrieval. And then if you want to keep it even longer and the data becomes colder, you can set up another lifecycle rule that says any objects that are more than a year old, move it from instant retrieval to Glacier Deep Archive. And you'll see a drop in the price already, right? So you can set up these lifecycle rules to tier your data based on the age of the data, which is why we say this is great for predictable access patterns. Your data ages according, your data becomes cold according to the age of the data. After 30 days, after 365 days, you can say, I want to transition your object. You set these lifecycle rules and the data will transition automatically, saving you cost, right? You can even set up an expiration policy. So let's say in the same use case, you want to expire your data and say, after 7 years, delete the data. You can do that. So you can have another rule for expiring your data. And we do recommend that you think about that. How long do you want to keep your data around? If you don't need to keep it around forever, then you should think about an expiration policy in your lifecycle policies also. Okay. We did add a couple of other features that help you with optimization with your lifecycle rules. These we did in reInvent 2021. So this was back in November of 2021. The first thing we did was we introduced a filter to say that apply the lifecycle policies to objects either over a certain size or below a certain size. Remember, for the lifecycle policy, you do pay for a transition fee as they transition, right? So you want to make sure that you don't willy-nilly set a lifecycle policy that moves 5 billion objects or 10 billion objects and get a surprise bill, right? So to help you limit that, there are filters that you can put in place and say, maybe lifecycle all objects which are greater than 5 GB or greater than 2 GB or whatever that criteria you want. So we introduced this in November of 2021. Again, this has got great feedback. It helps you limit the scope of your lifecycle policy, it helps you limit the cost there too. The second thing we did was we introduced the ability to set the number of non-current versions. So with S3, you can have versioning turned on, right? So what that means is that if you have a cat.jpg and you actually overwrite that with another cat.jpg, the previous version will be saved, right? And that can very quickly get added up over time. You can have 10, 15, 20 versions of the same object as you modify the object. With this kind of filter and rule, you can say, I want to keep only the last 3 or the last 4 or the last 5 versions of my object, and then we'll delete any more than that. So if you keep 5, we'll keep, if you specify 5, you'll only keep 5. Again, we recommend this as a best practice because if you don't do this and your objects are changing frequently, then you could have a lot of your storage taken up by what we call non-current versions of your data, right? And that can add up over time. So another best practice would be to make sure you specify the number of versions you want to store in your data, in your bucket for that particular object. Okay. So the key takeaways for data with predictable patterns is to make sure that you're using your lifecycle policies to move the data between storage classes based on the age of the data, and make sure you're fine-tuning them either by size and setting an expiration policy also. Don't forget the expiration policy. And finally, GIR or Glacier Instant Retrieval is a great storage class that you should absolutely leverage for data that you plan on keeping for a very, very long time. And you need to have millisecond access to it. If you don't need to have millisecond access to it, consider Glacier Flexible Retrieval or Glacier Deep Archive for even a lower cost. Okay? Now, what if you have unpredictable or changing access patterns that we talked about, right? For that, we have S3 intelligent tiering. $250 million is a number we like talking about. It is the amount that we have saved customers with intelligent tiering. Intelligent tiering will move your data among different tiers within it automatically based on the access pattern, and it happens without you having to take any action. And we estimate over the years since we launched it, since 2018, we have saved $250 million for our customers. We love the number because we know that enables you to leverage that savings into your business and helps you grow your business. So we are very happy and very proud about this number. So let's talk a little bit about what intelligent tiering is. Like I mentioned, it is the only cloud storage that will automatically monitor the access pattern of your data and move the data among different tiers to automatically reduce your cost over time. When we say it's intelligent tiering is a storage class, behind that storage class, it got 5 different tiers. There are 3 tiers which are synchronous and provide you with millisecond access to your data. And there are 2 asynchronous tiers that provide you async access to your data. And I'll show you that in a bit. The thing here is there's no operation overhead. We do monitor the data. There is a small monitoring fee because we're monitoring the access pattern of your data. But in exchange of that, there is no cost for the data to move between the tiers. There's no cost to retrieve the data. There's no retrieval fees, right? And just like our other storage classes, it's been designed for 11 nines of durability and also a very, very high availability of 99.9. Okay? So the way intelligent tiering works is that it is a storage class with 5 different tiers behind it. There are 3 synchronous access tiers and 2 async access tiers. The 2 async access tiers are shown in dotted line here because they're opt-in. You have to enable them. They're not on by default. And the reason for this is because they are async, right? Your application needs to be able to handle that model of doing a restore and then a get. But the 3 tiers, the frequent access, infrequent access, and archive instant access are on by default. The way this works is that when you ingest data into the intelligent tiering storage class, the data goes into what we call the frequent access tier. The frequent access tier is for data when it's first ingested, it is corresponding to S3 standard in cost, okay? And it'll remain there for 30 days at minimum. If the object has not been accessed for 30 days, it'll automatically move down to the infrequent access tier. The infrequent access tier is similar to S3 infrequent access in cost. So by moving the data from the frequent access tier to the infrequent access tier after 30 days, the cost drops for you. It'll remain in the infrequent access tier for another 60 days at minimum. And if the data has not been accessed for another 60 days, which means a total of 90 days, it'll move into the archive instant access tier. Again, dropping your cost down. Now, at any point, if the data is accessed, let's say the data has tiered down from the frequent to the infrequent access tier, and then somebody does a get. The data becomes hot again, it'll move back into the frequent access tier. And it'll go through the same cycle of 30, 60, tiering down, right? The big difference between this and the lifecycle rules that I talked about before, the lifecycle rules were based on the age of the data. This is based on the access of the data, right? So we are monitoring the access on the data. How many days ago did you last access the data? So which is why this is great for workloads where you have where you have unpredictable access patterns. It can become hot, it can become cold, doesn't matter. We monitor it, we move it automatically to the right tier based on the access pattern, right? And there is no cost for moving the data between the tiers like there is with the lifecycle rules. So that movement is already included in the cost of the monitoring fee that we have on this. So this is great for those kind of workloads. You do have 2 archive access and deep archive access, which are the async tiers. You can turn them on, and depending, again, on the access pattern, the data can tear down into those 2 storage classes also, okay? We made another enhancements to intelligent tiering in, I believe, in September of 2021. So one of the things that you have to remember with S3 is that data, which is smaller than 128 KB, really doesn't tear down, right? The minimum object size for tearing down into the other storage classes is 128 KB. So we decided not to charge you for those objects. The second change we made was intelligent tiering, like some of our other storage classes, had a minimum duration of 30 days. We removed that minimum. So right now, there is no minimum duration for objects stored in intelligent tiering. So, and the reason we did this is because we've been told by our customers that they would like to use intelligent tiering as their default storage class without having to worry about whether they got small objects, large objects, etc. So we listened to them, we made those two changes, and a lot of our customers right now are using intelligent tiering as their de facto storage class that they use. Even if they do have data with predictable access pattern, they still prefer using intelligent tiering versus doing the analysis themselves and thinking about how to tier the data down, right? So intelligent tiering is quickly becoming the de facto storage class for many, many of our customers going forward. And I would encourage you to think about doing the same. And when you do think about using intelligent tiering, don't ingest it into S3 standard, then move it into intelligent tiering. That'll just cost you a little bit more money. The best way to do it is just like I showed you previously, ingest the data directly into intelligent tiering by making sure you specify intelligent tiering in your put requests, like I've shown out here. Okay? The other thing is that if you want to reduce the cost even further beyond the 3 synchronous access tiers, we have seen a lot of our customers beginning to use the deep archive access tier within intelligent tiering. So the default is 30 days from frequent access to infrequent access, another 60 days from infrequent access into Glacier Instant Retrieval, and then you can tier it down. Now, the way you do that is by enabling those two tiers. As I mentioned earlier, those two tiers are not on by default because they're async. You need to enable them. You can enable either one or both, and you can choose the number of days before when it tiers down to those async access tiers. For the synchronous access tiers, those numbers are fixed, 30 days plus 60, right? But for the async access tier, those are configurable. The minimum duration is 90 days for the archive access, and it is 180 days for the deep archive access. But those are the minimums. You can increase that all the way to 2 years as a maximum for either one of those. So you can adjust the number when you enable it. You can make sure that you can tune the number of days before which it'll tear down for those two storage classes. Okay, the last thing we did was very recently in reInvent is that we also implemented what we're calling event notifications for the objects that move into the async tier. There are many use cases in media and entertainment, for example, where a MAM manages the data, right? And the MAM needs to know if the data is available synchronously or asynchronously. Previously, we would tier it down and there was no notification. Back in reInvent of 2021, we introduced event notification for data that will tier down to the async access tier. So for example, if you got the deep archive access tier enabled and the data tiers down there, you can configure a notification to be sent to SQS, to SNS, or even to a Lambda function. And you now know that the data is in one of the async access tiers, and your application can do the restore and get appropriately as when they want to retrieve the data. Okay. So the key takeaway here is that use S3 intelligent tiering for data sets that have unknown or changing access patterns. I would even say that if you do have data with known access patterns, consider intelligent tiering. It takes out all the thinking. You don't have to think about when the data becomes cold. It just takes all the thing. It's automatic, right? Moving the data between the tiers has no impact on performance. It has the same durability, 11.9, same availability, right? And there's no cost. There's a small monitoring fee, but there's no cost for moving the data between tiers, right? If you want to go even lower in cost, activate the async tiers. Remember, they're opt-in. They're not on by default there, right? So, and also use the final recommendation there is the last point, which is, use event notification if you have an application that needs to know when the data is gone to one of the async access tiers. Okay, let's talk about Storage Lens. Storage Lens was launched in November of 2020. And in that one short year, it's become one of the most popular S3 features we have. I have recommended every single one of our customers use it. So what is Storage Lens? Let me give you a quick summary on that. Storage Lens provides you with an interactive dashboard within the S3 console, and that provides you with visibility into your storage across the entire organization, right? So if you've got many accounts, you've got many buckets, doesn't matter. It provides you a dashboard that will give you visibility into your storage usage and activity across all of that. You can drill down by bucket, by storage class, by region, and even all the way down to prefix, and all these different levels are pre-aggregated, right? So even though the data is collected at the organization-wide level, you can choose to drill down into any one of these different levels. And it has usage and activity metrics, which I'll go into the next slide, but it got a total of 29 metrics that it collects across these different levels of aggregation. And then one of the best parts about Storage Lens is that based on the data it collects and analyzes, it will also give you recommendations for best practices and for cost savings, right? So this is something which is great. I love Storage Lens. So if you aren't using Storage Lens today, highly encourage you to use it right away. I talked about 29 metrics. The metrics can be broken up into two big categories. One is storage usage metrics. There are 15 of them. And then there are storage activity metrics. The storage usage metrics are more about the size and type of storage, while activity metrics are all about the requests that you're making to your storage. Within that, you can even break it up into further buckets. Within the usage metrics, you have the summary. This gives you a snapshot into your usage across the organization or at your account level, depending on which level you want to aggregate on. You have the cost efficiency metrics, which is why we're talking about it here, right? This tells you all about things like incomplete multi-part uploads. It tells you the number of bytes non-current versions of your objects are using up, right? And then you have data protection. It'll indicate to you what percentage of your bucket is encrypted, what percentage is not. And it'll flag it if it's not all encrypted, because that is the best practice to encrypt your objects. You also have your activity metrics. These are your gets, your puts, your retrieval rates, etc. And these help you identify buckets which are either active, very, very active, or buckets on the flip side which are not active. And then you may decide, well, these are not active, the data in this bucket is not active. Maybe it's a good candidate to archive it and put the data into Glacier Deep Archive, or maybe even Glacier Instant Retrieval, right? So these are all very useful metrics that you have with Storage Lens. One thing I want to point out on the cost efficiency metrics, the two most useful ones right off the bat there are the amount of bytes taken up by incomplete multi-part uploads. If you have large objects or you're using multi-part uploads and there's an error and you don't clean up, your application doesn't clean up after that, you are going to have a bunch of orphaned, incomplete multi-part uploads. You can use Storage Lens to identify them and clean it up. We've had a customer save about 10 to 15% of their storage bill by just cleaning that up. That was awesome. The other one is the number of bytes taken up by non-current versions of your object. I talked about versioning previously. If you didn't set a limit on the number of versions that you have, a bunch of your data or your storage costs could be taken up by older versions of your data. So you want to take a look at that and clean that up too. This is free. This part, there are two tiers of Storage Lens. All the storage usage metrics are free. You don't have to pay for it. If you want, you can turn on the activity metrics, which is the paid tier. But all the 15 storage usage metrics are free. So there's no reason not to use it, to take a look at it, to identify incomplete multi-part uploads, to identify the amount of storage used by non-current versions and clean them up. It's a very powerful tool that's out there, and I would encourage all of you to think about it. So we built Storage Lens because, number one, for cost efficiency. Number two, it gives you other insights into your data that I'll talk about now. And also, it was we didn't have anything that gave you organization-wide visibility previously. We had a bunch of other things, like we had inventory reports. Inventory reports give you a detailed look into your bucket, into your data, into your bucket, but that was only at your bucket level. With Storage Lens, you're getting this view across the entire organization, and you have the ability to drill down into different levels, right? So it's very, very powerful there. The other thing I would like to point out with Storage Lens is how you can use it to identify the access pattern of your data. If you remember, we had with the activity metrics, the puts, the gets, the retrieval rates, right? The retrieval rates kind of indicate how frequently you're accessing your data. If you look at this graph here with Storage Lens, you can see that there are spikes in the data access initially, and then it cools off. That's a red line. The blue line indicates the total amount of storage that you have. Relative to the total amount of storage that you have, you can see that this data cools off after November 21, after a certain number of days. So you know it is kind of cold, and you can make a choice at that point to create a lifecycle rule for that subset of data, if this is a bucket, to archive it, move it to GIR, or to move it into Glacier Deep Archive. You can also use it to identify data which has unknown or changing access patterns. So for example, here, you can see that this is very spiky data. It is hot, cold. You can see, in fact, at some point, you're even retrieving over 100% of the data that you have. You can see that there's no pattern here. Hot, cold, all the time. This indicates that it is data with unknown or changing access pattern. And for this one, you can then say, for this bucket, I'm going to use intelligent tiering, right? And automatically save data. The other thing we have done with Storage Lens is allow you to export the to publish the Storage Lens metrics into CloudWatch. And the reason we did that is because many customers told us that they have their own tools that they like to use to analyze data, to view the data for S3. By publishing it into CloudWatch, you can now use any of your tools that you have today to actually analyze the data. The other thing we have with CloudWatch that CloudWatch provides for you is the ability to do some anomaly detection. Think of anomaly detection as another way of setting alarms. But instead of you setting the threshold, what you do here is you allow CloudWatch to analyze the metrics for a certain amount of time, to create the right baselines, and then after some time, if the usage or requests go over or below the baseline, it will set out an alarm for you, right? So there's a kind of automatically baselining and detecting anomalies for you, and then notifying you of any deviation from the norm. So again, a very, very useful thing. Okay, so let me wrap it up real quick with some key takeaways. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but use Storage Lens. The usage metrics are free. There's no reason why you should not be. It's a very, very useful tool in helping you identify any cost savings. Use lifecycle rules for data which has known or predictable access patterns. Use intelligent tiering for data that has unknown. And definitely put in an archiving storage strategy. And I'll add two more to this. Don't forget to set expiration rules and to limit the number of versions that you have of your older objects. And with that, I thank you. Take a look at our skill builder. If you want to get some more information on there, you can log in there. There are over 500 free courses across all different topics at AWS. And once you build up your skill, maybe you want to get certified. And that's, again, a good thing to do there. And with that, thank you, and thank you for being here.